For 116 years, the building we now call the Fox Theater has played a significant role in the history and culture of the city of Stevens Point. It has impacted a wide variety of people with its rich history and unique past. Constructed in 1896, the building was originally an opera house called the Grand. The Grand hosted popular traveling acts of the early 20th century, including Harry Houdini and 1904 presidential candidate Eugene Debs. Additionally, the theater provided the Stevens Point community with opportunities to witness cutting-edge technologies, such as Edison picture shows and early traveling motion picture in 1904. The Grand Opera House closed in 1915 and reopened in 1920 as the Majestic Theater, which offered patrons both live performances as well as films. The theater was purchased by Fox Corporation in 1928, and in 1930, a motion picture with sound was screened in Stevens Point for the first time. Despite the economic hardships brought about by the Great Depression, the Fox Theater continued to provide affordable entertainment to the community throughout the entire 1930s. The now famous Fox Marquee was attached to the building in 1939. In 1953, young moviegoers formed a picket line outside of the theater in protest of an increase in ticket prices. This forced the Fox to close for 3 days before reopening with student-priced tickets. In 1982, the city approved a $12.2 million project to construct the Centerpoint Marketplace in the middle of downtown Stevens Point. This plan included the forced removal of 50 feet of the Fox Theater, which included the stage and the dressing rooms. The theater only operated for a short time after this redevelopment, officially closing its doors on April 25, 1986. Could you describe your interaction with the Fox, both your personal life and as your role as mayor?
Wow. So that's a long story, going back to the early 1980s, when it was still a functioning movie theater. I wasn't around when it was a stage theater. That had already changed. But when I was a young teenager, me and a friend of mine got a job cleaning up there after movies. And we thought it was cool, because not only did we get free movies as an employee, but we were there after hours and we got to explore all the cool things going on. I remember, going backstage, because the dressing rooms and everything were still back there. There were props and costumes and things like that, all disheveled and all over the place. But it was really cool seeing those things and imagining what went on, in the 1920s and so on. Fast forward a little bit, and I only live a few blocks away from downtown. I was there when they wound up tearing that back portion of the Fox Theater down to make way for the new mall. And it was all the big hype. Now, I didn't care about politics at that point or anything, wasn't old enough to vote still. So things just, that phase of the referendum and the contentious discussions in regards to the creation of the mall, I wasn't part of. I don't remember any of that. I just remember them tearing the back of it down and this new mall coming in. And going to the mall, in my opinion, it was never like they never had a heyday, the mall. We came on at the city of Stevens Point pretty late in the mall craze. We'd be like the people who bought a pet rock in the 1980s. Yeah, it's still okay, but we don't really want it. Anyway, at that point, the theater closed and sat vacant for a very, very, very long time.
So I've lived in Stevens Point this is my 11th year, and that entire time the theater has been closed. And because I'm interested in history, I've always been intrigued by the building, but as an older person, I also sit on the Historic Preservation Board. So issues about the downtown historic district all come through that board. And obviously this issue with the Fox Theater has been visited by our board members. So the theater has been empty the entire time that I've lived here. I have been in the building once, and that was probably 5 years ago-ish. And I've always wondered what it looked like on the inside, but when I got in there, it was clear that the period of time in which it was so-called renovated did a great deal of damage to the original architecture. So that front end area had the very sort of 70s drop ceiling thing going on. And it wasn't until you get into the theater space that you see some of the history of it. But it was in and is in very bad condition. And as you also probably know, when they put in the mall, the whole history of the mall, which created which angered the Sanders family, who were the owners of it, very much. They ended up taking off the stage portion of the theater, and the city ended up taking that land. The Sanders were very angry about that and sort of never got over it. And then the Sanders family ultimately, as I understand it, they donated the Fox to an organization with the idea that it might eventually be brought back as a theater.
And this is my opinion, but it seemed like the family, the Sanders family, who owned the theater, kind of rightfully held a grudge against the city. The city took the back half of that property, basically making it non-functional through what's called eminent domain. That gives municipalities the right to take property for the public good. So it was against the city or the family's wishes, and they felt hurt, and rightfully so. So it was my understanding that they chose to not do anything with that property, maybe out of spite, maybe out of nostalgia, whatever the reason. That's the primary reason it sat vacant. And I did my best to apologize to the family. One of the siblings lives locally here on behalf of that. But it never really stuck. And then somewhere in 2011, when Mayor Andrew Halverson was mayor, he worked with what was called the Arts Alliance of Portage County then, and the Sanders family. And the Sanders family agreed to turn it over, the Fox, turn it over to the Arts Alliance with the anticipation of reopening it as some sort of performance venue. Well, that happened, but then nothing else happened. Over the years, I've heard all sorts of stories about people who had business plans to do something, and they investigated what it would take to restore the Fox Theater, which was never grand, by the way. It was never very fancy. There's some interesting architecture, but it was, for all intents and purposes, it was plain, but has been here for over 100 years. And all of those business plans never seemed to add up. Meaning that the people who wanted to do something, once they put pen to paper and tried to figure out how they could make it profitable, none of them ever came to fruition. And that was probably for a variety of reasons, but regardless, the Arts Alliance then kind of sat on it too. There were some minor fundraising efforts that kind of started and then would fade away, and then there was a rebranding and that would fade away. And there was a lot of attempts to find some reasonable use for it. The Arts Alliance morphed into what is now Create Portage County. The building was turned over to an LLC, which they created, called Fox on Main. The marquee was restored by the family. That was great. I remember we lit it up once for the holiday parade, and that was nice to see, and it brought back a lot of memories for people. But still, nothing was really done. And Create came up with, most recently, an idea to save the facade of the building and redevelop the back parts into what they're calling the Idea Center, which was basically a community space for entrepreneurs and artists and gathering, similar to what they do now, ironically, in the old Weber Tackle building.
When I first moved back to town, I joined the Fox on Main board and was asked to be the president shortly after moving back. So I've served as the president since about 2013. And then I also was hired to work as the executive director of Create Portage County. A lot of things happen here. So basically we want the Idea Center to be your one-stop shop for any creative project in the community. So we basically have spaces, we have free access to internet, we have some technology that's shared, but we support everything from wood carvers like you saw earlier, to tech businesses, to artists, to people making podcasts, to people that are trying to do work in the community. The biggest hurdle we ran into initially was people just understanding the concept. We were playing around with a lot of new types of community spaces that were popping up in more urban markets but weren't really accessible to smaller towns yet. And so I think that was our first hurdle. We launched the Idea Center we're currently sitting in as a way to teach the community about these types of spaces and to show them the value of this type of space in our community. So that was the really big hurdle initially. And the other hurdle we ran into obviously with the project in general was just related to timing in the building. Had done some research into the concept of restoring it as a historic theater and found that it was really hard to make the business plan sustainable for that. We researched more than 30 different venues across the country that were similar sized venues in similar sized communities and found that most of them were operating in the red unless they had a significant financial partner, either a business entity that was supporting them or some sort of donor that was supporting them. And so really found that that was not something, we looked for that partner in the community and found that that was not something we could make work here. So we had this facility on Main Street that we wanted to activate. Simultaneously, we are in a building with the Idea Center that was a temporary building. It's owned by the county. We knew we weren't going to be here long term. And so the concept was to see if we could take this existing entity that needed a home and put it in a building that needed an identity. If we could marry those two together to reactivate that space on Main Street.
They tried, and I think they told me they raised about $1.5 million of a needed $3 million. However, the building wasn't maintained, and the roof had been leaking for years, and it got to the point now where inspectors went in there and noticed trusses on the roof are failing because of the water damage. That water had seeped down the walls and did damage to the walls. The basement at one point flooded out and there was like 3 feet of water in the basement. These things, because they weren't addressed properly when they happened, created more problems.
The raise order was put in place because there are some structural concerns with the building. There are 2 trusses, one that fell and has a temporary shoring right now, and one that was strained in the process of that other truss that fell. The building needs a new roof, and so some water was getting into the building. My understanding is those were the 2 main concerns that motivated the raise order. I think we've always agreed with the fact that it is time for the community to decide if something was going to happen in that building. Our timeline for figuring that out was a little bit longer than the city's, and we would have liked a little bit more time there. But again, we understood where the city was coming from in that concern.
If something isn't fixed, it tends to get worse before it gets better, right? It won't get better on its own. And if you notice now as you drive by, the nice skyline of the building, the roof, there's a cupola on it. And that cupola now is sagging, like tipping over because of the failing trusses. And again, the failing trusses aren't the only problem. The water had seeped in there, and we have pigeons and bats and what have you. We're relocating the bats, of course. Well, just a few weeks ago, it was October sometime, Fox on Main said, let's go back a little bit further. In July, when those architects and the engineers and inspectors went in there, they said, listen, this is probably not going to last another Wisconsin winter with the heavy snow. That roof is in imminent danger of collapse. Something needs to be done. So in July, the city issued what we call a raze or repair order to Fox on Main LLC, meaning we found some significant problems. You either need to fix it by X date, or we're going to tear it down. You will have to tear it down. And that deadline was October 18th.
Questions about how much the timing on that was pressing, whether or not, the real concern from the city was whether or not it could survive another winter. Our indications had been yes, but that was something that was really what was motivating their decision. But yeah, they were motivated by both public safety and concern for the buildings around it, that if the building for some reason collapsed, that it could be damaged to other structures around it.
Well, October 18th came and went. There were some attempts to get some contractors on board, so we extended the deadline. The reason it was October 18th is because if the property owner was unable to or unwilling to fix or tear that piece down, that responsibility would then fall on the city to tear it down. And we would need time to get contractors in place and the bids and the meetings that we have to go through to make sure that that happens. So the October 18th deadline was extended a little bit further because we saw some progress being done. Then, again, in late October, Fox on Main LLC sent us a letter saying, yeah, we're not going to do anything. So we won't be able to fix it, and we don't have the money to tear it down. At that point, I was a little taken aback. Don't want to see that history gone. So I gathered staff, including the inspector, and talked to the family and the Fox on Main LLC, along with members of Create, and we all sat at the same table and said, listen, we don't want to see this building get torn down. I don't want to see this building get torn down. What can we do? And we came up with a plan around that one table that the city could take ownership of the property for $1. We would likely have money invested in the raising of the entire building anyway, so we would be able to tear down the bad part. But it was determined that the front third of the building was likely stable enough where it was worth repairing. There were still some problems with it, leaky roof and things like that, but if we addressed that, the front third was likely stable enough to save. And we would be willing to do that if the Fox on Main turned it over to the city for $1.
At this point, we've divorced the two projects, so the Idea Center project is moving forward with the idea of a different location. That largely came from, again, two things. One, we were given a timeline to complete all the work for the first phase of our project, which was to demolish parts of the building and secure the rest of the building. We were given a deadline that, according to the contractors we talked to, was not feasible, and so we had to back out of the project because of that deadline. And then when we entered into conversations with the city about potentially selling the building, the city requested that we sell the building with no strings attached. And so we explored the idea of a first right of refusal and whether or not we could be the first purchaser if that all worked out well, and we're not given that opportunity. So at that point, we decided to fully divorce the projects. At this point, we don't have firm plans to know whether or not they could come back together at some point in time, but things don't look like they will.
So for the Sanders family, the Fox Theater is the auditorium, not the facade, it's the auditorium. So the raze order is to tear down the back half, or back portion, back 2/3 of the building, which is the auditorium. So in the Sanders view, if you're tearing down the auditorium, you have torn down the Fox. And this idea of tearing down everything except the front third and saving the facade, they disagree with that. They would rather see the whole thing come down and turn that area into they imagine a parklet, or save the building. And they feel that the city would ultimately save money by repairing the roof structure, replacing the roof and saving the structure, than to raise the whole thing. So what they would like to see is the whole building saved by replacing the roof. And they feel that that's what the city should be spending its money on, not raising it. But if the city enacts the raise order, which it will, they would prefer the entire thing to come down, not including the facade. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you think that since they spoke on it on Monday, that's going to influence the raise order or what's going to be torn down at all?
Well, they hold the restriction deed. So there were a set of restrictions that they applied to the Fox when they gave it to Fox on Main. And if they do not release those restrictions, then the sale happen, then the city has only one choice, which is tear down the entire thing.
So if the building comes down, the costs associated with that would be assessed specially to the owners. The owners have already made it clear, though, that they don't have the means or the desire to do anything. So likely that would sit on the tax rolls delinquent. I think it's 3 years, and then the county will take it through a tax forfeiture, at which point the city would then be able to acquire it. So 3.5 to 4 years would go by before we were able to do anything with it, because we don't own the building. That's why it's really important that the Sanders family signs off on this dissolving this restrictive agreement that they have. So the city can take ownership of it, try and save the facade, save that piece of history, and then begin redevelopment opportunities right away. If that happens, we will put up RFPs for ideas probably before Christmas.